Let's talk about sexual violence. It's a massive public health crisis, and if we ever hope to prevent it, we have to understand its roots. So today, we're going to dig into some research that asks a huge question. What exactly does gender inequality have to do with it? Now, you might think the answer is obvious, but as you're about to see, the data tells a much more complicated story.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to get a handle on the sheer scale of this crisis. Then, we'll look at how researchers can even measure something as complex as inequality. After that, we'll see a finding that, well, it lines up with what you'd probably guess. But then, we hit a paradox that really flips the script. And finally, we'll try to sort out what this all means for actually moving forward.
So, to really get why this research is so important, we have to start with the human scale of this issue. We need to move beyond just ideas and look at the real numbers.
25.5 million. Let that number just sink in for a second. According to a major national survey, that's how many women in the United States report having experienced, completed, or attempted rape in their lifetime. That number is it's staggering, and it's exactly why understanding prevention is so incredibly urgent.
A number like that forces you to ask some really big questions, right? We can look at individual stories, of course, but what about the bigger picture? What are the societal roots of this crisis, the things that are baked into our culture? That's what this study is all about. It zooms in on that very specific, very complex link to gender inequality.
So, if you're going to investigate a link like that, you run into a huge problem right out of the gate. How in the world do you measure something as big and messy as gender inequality? How do you compare a place like New York to a place like Mississippi? Well, it turns out researchers have a pretty smart tool for doing just that.
It's called the Gender Inequality Index, or GII. The UN actually developed it to get a consistent picture of gender-based disadvantage across different places. The main thing you need to know is that it's a composite score. It pulls together a bunch of different data points. And for our purposes, the takeaway is simple. The higher the GII score for a state, the greater the gender inequality is there.
So what's actually under the hood here? What goes into this index? Well, it breaks down into three big categories. You've got reproductive health, which looks at things like maternal mortality. Then there's empowerment, which tracks stuff like how many women are in state government or have advanced degrees. And finally, you have the labor market. Basically, are women participating in the workforce? You mix all that together and you get a surprisingly detailed picture of gender equality in a given state.
All right, so now we have our tool, the GII. We can finally start looking for those connections we talked about. And this first finding, well, it's the one that, frankly, pretty much everyone expected to see.
Yep, just as decades of theory and past research would predict, the data showed a really clear connection. States with more gender inequality, the ones with those higher GII scores, were also the states with higher rates of rape using physical force. It pretty much confirms that these broader societal structures that hold women back are directly tied to this incredibly brutal form of violence.
And what's really interesting is how this plays out on a map. The study's authors point this out directly. You can literally see the overlap. The regions with higher inequality, the South, the Southeast, the mountain regions, are the exact same places where you see higher rates of forced rape. The data it lines up.
Okay, so that seems pretty cut and dry, right? More inequality equals more violence. Case closed. But this is where the story takes a really sharp and unexpected turn, because that neat, tidy relationship completely falls apart. In fact, it flips on its head when you look at other kinds of sexual violence. Okay, just look at this, because this is the whole paradox right here. On the left, it's what we just saw. More inequality is linked to more forced rape. But look at the right. It's the total opposite. The states with less inequality, the places we'd think of as more progressive, actually had higher rates of things like street harassment and other unwanted sexual experiences that don't involve physical contact. And get this, it was true for both women and men. It's a complete reversal.
So what on earth is going on? Well, this isn't just a fluke. Researchers have actually seen this weird pattern before. It's sometimes called the Nordic paradox, because some of the most gender-equal countries in the world, like in Scandinavia, have shockingly high rates of violence against women. One of the leading theories is something called a backlash effect. The thinking is, as women gain more power and equality, and traditional gender roles get challenged, well, some parts of society push back hard.
So we're left with this really confusing picture. One finding that makes perfect sense, and another that feels completely backwards. So what do we do with that? Where does this leave us when it comes to actually trying to prevent any of this?
Okay, let's try to pull this all together. Takeaway number one.
Gender inequality at a societal level is absolutely a driver of sexual violence. But, and this is the huge but, progress isn't a simple straight line. Making things more equal doesn't automatically fix everything. In fact, it might even cause a temporary spike in other forms of harm, like harassment. That means our prevention efforts have to be smart, and they have to plan for that kind of resistance. And finally, the study gives us a really concrete clue. There's a super strong link between things like adolescent birth rates and forced rape. That suggests that investing in reproductive health care and education isn't just a social good, it could be a direct tool for violence prevention.
Now, of course, it's really important to say that no single study ever gives us all the answers. The authors are really upfront about the limitations here. This data is just a snapshot in time, so it shows a connection, a correlation, but it can't prove that one thing causes another. And there could be other factors involved, like economic conditions. That's just how science works. You're adding one important piece to a much larger puzzle.
And so this research leaves us with a really tough but really important final thought. It suggests that building a safer, more equal world isn't just about knocking down old walls. It's also about being ready for the ground to shake when those walls start to crumble. So the question for all of us becomes, as we push for change, how do we also prepare for and maybe even prevent the backlash that change can create? That's a complicated question, but it's one we absolutely have to figure out.